All right, we ready to begin? Going to start recording now. Okay, at 9:33, would like to welcome everyone to the first meeting of the Oregon Mechanical Specialty Code Review Committee meeting on Thursday, August 29th. And we're going to try and get started here. First, I guess we'd like to make sure and just get an introduction of the members of the committee that are on here today. Just for the record, I'm Mark Heiser with Building Codes Division, the mechanical program head, and would like to first, I guess, go through the committee members who are here. Let's start. I'm looking left to right. So we'll start with Tim. If you could introduce yourself and check your microphone here, that'd be great to hear a little about you. Just a quick introduction and background, maybe, just to let the people know about you. Thanks.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, Mark. Tim Ellie, I'm a mechanical engineer at PAE Engineers. I've been here for about 16 years. Got a graduate degree from mechanical engineering from Portland State University. So happy to be working in the state and helping the team here.
All right, next, John Rodriguez, if you don't mind, quick introduction.
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Rodriguez, Lincoln County Building Official. I've been here for 2 years, and I've been in inspections and everything for over 20 years. I used to work for BCD as an inspector out of the Pendleton office, and I've been a building official for 5-6 years now.
All right, next, how about Ian?
Yeah, hi, Ian Casey with Northwest Natural. I work in our Building Energy Codes and Standards division. I've been there almost 3 years, and prior to that, about 10 years working for a design build mechanical contractor in Oregon and Southwest Washington, doing HVAC design for primarily commercial applications. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Jim Brady, how about you next?
There we go. I got unmuted. My name is Jim Brady. I'm a mechanical engineer. I also went to Portland State many years ago. I'm semi-retired after 40 years of as a mechanical contractor. I also sit on the SMACNA board, and this is my first time sitting in on this meeting, but I'm glad to be here, and hopefully I can learn something and maybe, if I'm lucky, add some value. So thanks for having me.
Next here, Mark, are you going through the names up top? So
yeah, hi, my name is Mark. Been with Jackson County as an inspector for 4 years. Previously, he was building official at Curry County. Prior to inspection career, was a general contractor in California and in Oregon. This is my first committee. I'm happy to be here and happy to learn and hopefully have some input. Thank you.
all right, and not here currently, but hopefully will be on soon, is Jay Hansen, who serves as the mechanical board chair, to get someone from the actual board that will review this. So, but with that, I think it's time to get to the agenda and sort of how we'll be doing the code and what we're up to today. So I'd like to thank everybody for their participation. This committee, what we're doing is looking at our current mechanical code is the 2022 Oregon Mechanical Specialty Code. When we go through a code adoption process, we look at what has happened at the national model. That our current code is primarily structured around the 2021 International Mechanical Code with Oregon amendments. And so together that became the 2022 Oregon Mechanical Specialty Code. That's sort of our starting point. And what we're looking at is integrating the 2024 model code changes, and that's most of what we're going to review as part of this, into the 2025 Oregon Mechanical Specialty Code. We look at what are current Oregon amendments that may change the model code, proposals. We have no public proposals to do a code change. And what changed at the national model level to sort of bring everything together to recommend to the mechanical board changes for a new sort of combined mechanical code that would be adopted as the 2025 mechanical specialty code. What we're doing is an informal process for the most part. We're really looking at the changes. We really want this to be an open discussion where we're getting feedback from you, the users out there, to make recommendations to the board or changes, things that might need a little tweaking or process. We have available today, it's the matrix. We apologize, things have been going a little slow. So today we are going to really try and go through the chapters, most of the pieces, and have discussion today, but then actually go through final approval and recommendations to the board at the next meeting. There are a couple of items we won't go through today. We may have some initial discussions, but it'll be at the next meeting where we'll either by chapter or if there are specific code changes that we want to get into in detail, we'll and have individual motions on some of the other changes. We do look at, and I believe this is where Pierre will hop in. So you see his hand raised. I'll let, yeah, and real quickly, we have staff. We don't have our other introductions. We have Laura and Katie in the room here with the division staff, and Richard Rogers is in the room today along with Kelly Thomas from the building code division. But we'll go to Pierre right now. I know he has some things to say.
And sorry, Mark, I just wanted to also introduce myself to the committee. My name is Pierre Sabah. I'm a policy analyst for the division. I work with the mechanical board and I work with Mark on mechanical stuff. So I will be interjecting / annoying Mark here and there, reminding him to talk about fiscal impact so that I can record it for our rulemaking process. So if you hear from me, I'll just kind of be keeping the committee and everyone on track to discuss possible fiscal increase, decrease. But yeah, I'm here to answer any potential policy questions. So I just wanted to do a quick intro as well. Sorry to interrupt, Mark. I just wanted to also introduce myself to the committee.
Yes, as sort of a reminder on that, when we do get to beyond the informal discussion, when we get to making motions, we have to end everything with does this have a fiscal impact or not? And that is to let our board know that there might be potential cost changes involved. We try and note those in your matrix. If you've got a green, or if you have color sheets, it shows in green if the proponent who made the change at the national model level said that there was a potential cost increase. We may even show you what those proposals look like over time. We have them available to flash on the screen. If they said there was a fiscal impact, we're noting that for you now. And with that, if you don't mind, we can sort of do a quick dive in to the chapters, and we're going to have them put up on the screen. We'll first show chapter 2 and just the general introduction to it. The document that's being shared, the PDF file, it has some nice color coding. If you'll note at the top, how we go through our code adoption process is when it's blue underline, single underline, that means it's an existing Oregon amendment of language that has been put in by the state that is different from the national model code. If it's red strike through, that is something where the division has taken out language. It is modified or deleted something from the model code. If you'll notice what's being highlighted right now, we're showing that whenever we're in the code, we always strike international building code and turn it into building code, because in our definitions, building code becomes the Oregon structural specialty code. When it's mentioning plumbing code, it's the Oregon plumbing specialty code. When we don't reference the international fuel gas code, because that in our code book is actually Appendix C. We take the entire Oregon international fuel gas code and bring that into one mechanical code document. Other items are orange dotted underline language. One thing that we do is when there is a construction provision in the fire code that is actually under the jurisdiction of the Building Codes Division, not the State Fire Marshal. We bring those pieces that are relative, fire code language that's relative to either the building code or the mechanical code into the code. You'll see some, we grab things, bring them in and modify them such that they're here so that you can see construction items. And if it's plumb struck through, that means it's maybe some changes that were made to the IFC that are being brought in as well. That would be from the 2024 IFC, correct, Laura? That's the book that we brought from. Purple is IBC, IEC, or I am actually purple. That should actually say it's the International Mechanical Code language. Yeah, we missed one in our title. But if it's purple, that is new model code language. If it's blue dotted, that's something that's new in the model code that came from something like 82 revisions that were made to the International Mechanical Code. We're going to go over substantive ones on our matrix list. A lot of them were really changes and modifications, updates to like definitions, editorial fixes. That this is really a good year for getting a lot of the model code made a lot of good changes to help understand the code a little bit better. And then if there is blue dotted underline, that is new Oregon language. These are things that either the division is proposing. We will go over a couple of items for this code cycle, or if it's a red double strike through, that's something that the division is proposing to strike through, or should this committee decided to make a change, that will show as blue dotted underline or red double strike through if there's something that this committee feels should be taken out of the model code. With all that, here we are in the definitions. And in this, we'll scroll down until we hit at least one of the first changes to the code. This blue item here about boiler, this is has been in the code in the past. This is an Oregon amendment. Anything that has to do with boilers, it starts with our boiler board. The boiler and pressure vessel code is the starting point if it's a pressure vessel. If it's not regulated under the boiler code, then we do have things here in the mechanical code that are relative to them, which would include fuel supplies to boilers and piping outside of the boiler code. All right, we'll slide down a little more. We'll keep going through this. We have our own words for what we use for code officials. I want to point out on this one again, when you see in the code these informative boxes, they aren't adopted code. This is where the division might point out where there are other rules and languages outside of the code. It's sort of informative. It points you to, here's, again, on this one, where the water heaters are covered either under the plumbing code or under the boiler program, and whatever's left over and still in the code from the boiler or water heater or the plumbing code boards, we can cover here. But further, we'll scroll down to, again, these are all Oregon amendments. We're going to try and find a change from the model code. We cover flood hazard, point to those regulations which are outside. A couple of them may not have made it into purple. There were a couple of the definitions may not have made it into purple. We will check on that. If we have to get you an update on that, we will. But I think there was at least few new definitions. Moving to chapter 3. On your matrix, this is where we're going to look at the first matrix item. If you'll look at a change, the first big change is to section 306.5 about ladders and access to the roof. were changes 13 and 14 at the national model code level. What they have done is most of these modifications are to align the roof access with federal OSHA requirements. So they are looking at the change to, I can zoom in just a little bit more. At the roof level, at the top landing, there's a new portion 11, which says that when you get to the roof, when the roof hatch opens, you need to have a landing just like at the base of a 30-inch by 30-inch space adjacent to the hatch, not behind where the hatch opens, or at least a landing to stand on when you're at the top. There is also, yeah, the changes to rungs is not showing. Can we bring up the model code change? That would be the previous one to this, the change number 13. On your screen, the items that changed in the model code are the distance between the ladder and, say, a wall. It used to be, I believe it's now for a the toe distance and not less than 16 inches between rails. They were allowing between 7 and 18 inch and 12 inches, excuse me, between rails. It's now set at a 16-inch spacing between rails, which is aligning with OSHA. That is in item number 4, subpart 4 for ladders. Let's scroll down a little more. There is also, where's our top piece? There we go. That's the one. So the side railings, it's about having the landing platform at the top. The toe spacing between the ladder and the wall needs to be 7 inches, not 6 inches, but not more than 12 in space. Item number 4, it's about not, it's the distance between rails. I think we've got to double up on that. Scrolling further down, the biggest issue that goes along with OSHA is at the very top. Where is that? Is to have a, it's the very number 1. Railing or something shall extend above the roof edge. Side rails extend not less than 42 inches. If we can go to the diagram, that will really help show what has changed on this, is to really allow that when you get to the roof, a lot of the roof hatch manufacturers now have an extension at the very top end. As you can see, a 42-inch extension at the top. Some of these come with roof hatches to go up past. The top, to get up at a landing, you need to give you something to where you're not crawling out of the enclosure. Any questions about this item number 306.5? And it does indicate that there's a potential cost increase on this. And after a while, I'll start, on any future items, I will start going Bueller, and looking for comments from the room. Okay.
No comments here, Mark. Looks good.
Code officials, any word from your end about seeing this, or as we know that, yes, that sometimes people show up and yeah, it's a bit of protection for building owners in that they will now be have some last minute corrections from like OSHA for worker safety. So, so let's move on to item 307.2.1, condensate disposal. Go back to the main. As we have some Oregon amendments and would like to see about continuation of these or other through the years, we've had in section 307.2.1 about condensate disposal, either we've had minimum sizing based upon the tonnage, where you could have smaller units where it could be located on bigger units. Just in the past, there had been conditions in Oregon where people looked at where the disposal went to of larger units running across roofs, slip, or items like that. So Oregon has modified this a little bit. Condensate drains, part 3, from rooftop units shall discharge in accordance with 1 or 2, or shall discharge on rooftops where the condensate does not discharge into a street, alley, or other areas such as to cause nuisance. This has been, I believe, probably well over 15, 20 years worth of language. I don't know if there's any, we just want to point out again that it's a continuation of what's been a current Oregon amendment. If there's no comment now, we also want to make sure people look at this in the future. We wanted you to see that, but one other item, we do have a new proposed Oregon amendment under section 307.4 about condensate drain subject to freezing. There are some items that run with and will produce condensate in winter, and we're having some reports about some of the heat pump water heaters that sometimes their discharge, depending on where it goes, will potentially freeze, which causes backup, which causes an item to go off on safeties. And so we're looking at a potential way to address that, that this is a proposed language for if a condensate is subject to freezing, whether from dehumidification, heat pump water heater, or evaporator coils that produce condensate year round, shall discharge to an approved location or be provided with freeze protection to the point of discharge in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. That's new language. Any feedback from the group, or we can move forward? But this is a new item.
Mark, just clarifying, is or the intended word there, not and? So you shall discharge to an approved location or freeze protect it to the point of discharge. So can you not freeze protect a long discharge line to an approved location?
So the approved location would, the approval would be to the standard indoor location. So a location where it's sometimes they may have something that works in, and this is from a local review. So the building official would have to go, yes, that's acceptable. Or if or it can be required to, if it's not an approved location that is freeze or where it would be allowed without freeze protection, or if you don't get the approval from the building official, you then add freeze protection as the intent of the language. It probably should be flipped.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it would not be crystal clear to me as a design engineer what I need to do here.
Would that work for you? To shall be provided with freeze protection to the point of discharge in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions, or discharge to an otherwise approved location? Because the approved, that means that's reviewed by the building official. So it's
okay. Yeah, fair enough.
Approved location. I think that will do. Does that look good? Or shall be discharged to an approved location?
Yeah, I think that helps me some, at least.
There may be some times when it might work, that there's always these alternate, with this type condition where something could be done without a freeze protection, but.
I see. So the approved is just, yeah, it's like if you can get the HJ to buy off on what you're doing, that works too.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. So we can scroll through the rest of chapter 3 or just move on to chapter 4 if you'd like. There have been in the past some organ specific items about protection of water heaters and items in garages and are subject to being hit by a car. That's still in the code. We do take out those two items about explosion. 310 and 311 have been removed in the past. They're more related to the building code and aren't having the requirements here. That's just a carryover of past changes. So, all right. So moving on to ventilation, there's one item I found, one thing that isn't on the agenda, but we do want to point this out. And again, we're going to do a lot of some additional discussion on ventilation for dwelling units in the next meeting. But one item that did come from the structural code committee is that in the past, we had natural ventilation section 402 not adopted, but provided for guidance in the mechanical code due to the fact that the actual windows and sizing and the like was being done in the structural code by the architect. That was left on that side. They are now moving the structural code committee has determined, and in conjunction with the division, that natural ventilation section 402, which is allowed for everything currently other than some limitations for building types and structural types that require mechanical ventilation, that the natural ventilation sections be in the mechanical code. So one thing that is happening is that section 402, the note box you're seeing there, is being struck so that now the mechanical engineer can look at both whether or not natural ventilation can work and or whether mechanical ventilation is used. So, and we'll go up to part 1. 401, there's another modification up here. I need to point this out, is that under 401.2, it says every occupied space shall be ventilated by natural means in accordance with section 402. That used to say building code, or mechanical means in accordance with section 403. So that's bringing everything in to the mechanical code now for ventilation for occupants of buildings. And one other item while we're on this section is what is being struck is for dwelling units. We used to have confusing language. This is in addition to what's going to happen later on when we discuss ventilation for dwelling units, is that model code had dwelling units complying with the air leakage requirements of the International Energy Conservation Code, or ASHRAE 90.1. In there, we are just striking that part because we do adopt ASHRAE 90.1 and it's sort of redundant. So that is being changed, that dwelling units shall be ventilated by mechanical means in accordance with section 403. And of course, from model code and currently in our code, ambulatory facilities and group I2 occupancies also shall be ventilated by mechanical means. So one note, excuse me, one note we will discuss is we had last code cycle, we had put in an exception to note that rooms within private dwellings that contain a bathtub, shower, spa shall be provided with mechanical ventilation in accordance with provisions of table 403.3.1. What was happening in prior versions of the code is it wasn't clear that bathrooms had to have an exhaust fan. So that when we do our discussion on residential ventilation in the next meeting, we can see about potentially getting rid of that requirement. It will probably become redundant at that point. We do add an informative note in the box that heating and air conditioning controls shall conform with the energy code, because there are a few mechanical items that under ventilation that are covered by the energy code, especially a lot of things relative to demand control ventilation. All right. With that, we will go to table 403.1.1, which is one of the big model code changes. Under changes M20, M21, M22, there were a few updates. The ventilation tables, you'll see a lot of purple on this one. We'll scroll through this a bit. They've added animal facilities, coffee stations, corridors, occupiable storage rooms for liquids and chills. Laundry room ventilation rates are now clearly noted for hotels, motels. Outpatient facilities. This is one item where I think we may have to look at our footnotes on this when we get to them, that they are controlled under Oregon Health Authority, but having redundant numbers here, we'll have to just make sure that the footnotes are correct on that. And sometimes, they're dental items that aren't covered under OHA. They have added adult changing stations. That was one specific note versus just your average bathroom. It is a room with an adult changing station is required to have an exhaust rate. Banks and lobbies were added. Refrigerated warehouses less than 50 degrees. They just put in a note for what those warehouses are supposed to be. And a few hazardous material minimum ventilation requirements. And if you'll note at the bottom, they added telephone closets. And it has nothing in there. I do want to, let's go down to footnotes I and J. And we will probably have to have an additional note about facility. Well, I think that under 403, we already note that anything covered under, I believe it's standard 170 is actually items covered by Oregon Health Authority. One item we are also noting, I just want to point out, is footnote M. In alignment with the residential code, we do have a requirement for all rooms containing bathing or residential spa facilities shall be provided with mechanical ventilation system controlled by dehumidistat, timer, other similar means of automatic control. And that is for intermittent ventilation, of course. And then footnote N about rooms containing residential bathing facilities, our note that aligns with, both of these align with the residential code, by the way, to say that if continuous ventilation is used, about sound ratings for fans. And so this is for outside of the residential. There are certain sleeping room items that are beyond what is covered in section 403.2.3, I believe it is. But so if we can, these are footnotes to residential exhaust. That was the coverage for the minimum ventilation rates. All of these came from ASHRAE 62.1, just to let people know on that. That was the main point of, other than the adult changing room. So this was a big proposal to align the tables with what's in ASHRAE standard 62.1 2019 or 2020 and 2022. Are there any questions on that? I know we'd like to give you some time to look over this between now and the next meeting, but any concerns about going with the latest ASHRAE 62.1 for ventilation rates. All right, let's go to what? Oh, yes, and they did note that under the ICC that some of the changes actually do result in a decrease in cost. And I believe some of the methods for doing it were a change that allowed for less. Some of the ventilation rates may have changed to where it could be a cost decrease. Let's go to, I'd like to keep these in order. We'll go to 407.1 again about our ventilation requirements. Oh, okay. Okay.
Pierre, do you have that?
Yes, I wrote down I pretty much almost copy pasted that.
Perfect, thank you.
They are doing an update to the latest references to the latest standard 170 for healthcare facilities. In Oregon, we do have for ambulatory facilities and group I2 occupancies that are subject to licensure by the Oregon Health Authority, getting in language to make sure that we have alignment with the ventilation rates that they set under their statutes and rules. So we want to make sure that we do get that aligned, and that we also do mention the latest ASHRAE ASHE standard 170 and NFPA 99. Those are the healthcare ventilation standards. So those, as you can see on the board here, this is most of it's long-standing Oregon, but they are bringing in the ASHRAE 170 as a reference standard, which is also aligning with how they've finally fixed the ASHRAE 62.1 language. And also in standard 90.1 there, that language is being cleaned up. Just as a side note to help make sure people know when ventilation rates are going through healthcare versus standard ventilation language through ASHRAE 62.1. Any comments on that, on the ambulatory care section? If not, we will go to section 404 on enclosed garages and note something that we've had here for enclosed garages. Any garage is allowed or permitted to operate intermittently. So you can either do continuous fans or intermittent operation. If you want to do intermittent operation or are required to do so by the energy code, this is just clarifying the language to make sure that people are allowed to have either full on and intermittent operation if you have the correct detectors for NOx and carbon monoxide. It's a standing Oregon amendment. Just wanted to point that one out, that is continuing forward and does have alignment to make sure people are aware of the energy code, because the energy code doesn't require going as low as shown here. So but you are allowed to go even lower on your ventilation rate down to 0.05. As long as you have the sensors to turn the fans up when you have the need for air change. So that's a standing amendment. Any questions on that one? And we'll be continuing with that for the next cycle then, if we don't hear anything here. Let's move on to chapter 5. And there is a change about exhaust outlet locations. When we adopted the code last cycle, we put in an amendment that was in the current model code about these, I guess, concentric inlet and outlets. One change that is pretty significant and potentially helpful for people is that in item 501.3.1, item 3, the requirement normally for an exhaust outlet for environmental air, so this is just basic general space air or even bathroom exhaust, it had to be at least 3 feet from any operable opening for natural ventilation, or I say a door or a window. However, they have added that an exception for where the exhaust opening is at least or not less than 1 foot above a gravity opening. So this is allowing for a bit more flexibility in the design community, say for housing and or just anywhere where you're putting a bathroom fan out a sidewall, as long as it's more than 1 foot above a door or other operable window. It's a reduction from 3 feet to just 1 foot. So that's the change to the from the 2024 International Mechanical Code. And that is listed as potentially a cost decrease because yes, it will definitely allow for a little more flexibility for an apartment or condominium design. Any questions or concerns on that item? Otherwise, we'll take that as
Mark, no specific questions about that. I'm noticing that there's no change to the 10-foot requirement for mechanical intake, which can also be a challenge in the same projects.
no change on that from the model code, no.
Yeah.
Would you like to discuss that?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a significant maybe amendment for us to make, but just reading the second half of the item 3 there for the operable opening, it's odd that the next sentence then says separation's not required between intake air openings and living space exhaust where a factory built intake exhaust combination termination fitting is used,
Yep.
which means like they have to be 10 feet apart or 0 feet apart if you use that fitting. And it also seems like that really more belongs in the mechanical intake separation item
So
2, but
that what you just read, that
Mhm.
separation is not required, that was brought to us during the 2022 adoption cycle because it was going into the 2025. We could, yes, it's that concentric inlet outlet. It magically does allow
Right.
a great separation, but it is also for the same unit. So
right.
it's your exhaust going out and your intake going in. So the 10-foot potentially could be between tenants
Different
and
units.
spaces. So if you'd like to think of something for where it is also, once again, the same space.
Yeah. Is there, and I don't want to take
that-
too much of the group's time here, but I think there's a provision within ASHRAE to do a calc about this too, right? With the velocity of air leaving and how far away you need to be based on how the orientation also of the discharge, that in my limited experience, that calc becomes pretty friendly to not prescriptively meeting the code. But I don't see in here that we explicitly allow an alternative calculation method to evaluate it, per the ASHRAE standard or whatever. So maybe I can, Mark, just look at what that is and think about whether a sentence at least proposing this option to use a separate calculation methodology is acceptable.
Yes, so use of 62.2 is, and again, back to the design engineer, there's a lot of flexibility for you on the quantities and the like, and 62 is mentioned back under chapter 4. But yes, if let's scroll up real quick. I'm seeing, okay, so no, that would be something for consideration, is to mention that here, maybe mentioning or as otherwise approved using ASHRAE 62 on environmental exhaust. I know we'll always, this is, when we're talking environmental exhaust, it's bathrooms, it's general ventilation air. That could be something that could be looked at for consideration. That would be a great piece to bring back for the next meeting, is maybe an additional little note there, because yes, I do know that 10-foot is rather restrictive for that distance.
I'll take a look at it, Mark, and come with something next time.
All right. Let's look at item for 501.6 about common ducts. And it was a clarification really that was added for when we're doing, when a designer is doing a common exhaust system. We know that we have good language in the code currently where you're, going into a common shaft, rising to a roof, about that maintaining negative pressure. What they've done is in this section added the discharge from fan serving a separate dwelling unit or sleeping unit shall not be connected to a common duct or shaft, except where the common duct or shaft is maintained at negative pressure. This is potentially allowing a little bit of flexibility where it's not going through, say, a shaft and you can go through a duct. There may be the ability to where you could take 2 units out through a sidewall, but it would have to have a continually operating fan through ductwork when the shafts are well covered later in the code, but where you're subducting and those type systems. But this is an allowance, and actually was intended to say you could connect 2 to a common duct that may not go through a shaft, but just to make sure that you aren't taking 2 bathrooms from separate apartments, combining them and taking them out unless there's something maintaining a negative pressure to the exterior. Now you can duct them separately to the discharge location, but it's just to make sure that you aren't blowing one unit's bathroom air back into another unit. That was part of the reasoning behind this, to make sure that if you're combining from 2 different apartments that you are maintaining a negative pressure in that combined duct. Avoid that recirculation.
And maintained in this case would not imply it needs to be on standby power, I assume, like it does with the subduct.
Correct. This is not talking about standby power at this point. There are other, when you get into fire life safety and shafts and multiple floors, then you're going to start talking about, yes, those additional issues.
I just wondering if the word maintained carries any weight there, but it stands to reason that shouldn't be required. Anyway, thank you.
All right. Let's move on to 504.9.2. The next item on our agenda today is duct installation, current Oregon amendment. The board in the past for closed dryer duct, the model code had brought in something that you could use screws, but only if they didn't penetrate more than 1/8 of an inch inside the duct. And in the past, the board and committee have felt that, well, how do you know when you're just looking at the outside of a sealed up duct what screws they actually used? And some committee members had said, yeah, they'd seen bigger than, ones that went in further and essentially provided, a rather substantive collection point for lint in dryer duct. And they wish to maintain the dryer duct is done with smooth wall the entire way, and which would mean taping. So this is a Oregon amendment that asking whether you wish to, that would be considered for maintaining this amendment due to past actions of the committee. That was one item we wanted to bring up for you. If no comments, we will move on to transition ducts under 405.9. Oops, it was already up there. We do scratch. About the transition ducts on dryers being listed and labeled. This is the section of duct from the dryer to the wall outlet. We don't regulate that in that it comes in later post construction. The the intent of this from model code level is to say, don't use the very, very, very cheap thin nylon or Mylar plastic transition ducts that aren't labeled, but this was taken out because it is actually a piece that we don't regulate in the field because it is a post-occupancy item. So just noting that what has happened there and from past actions. So wanted to bring that to everybody's attention in case someone wanted to look at it in further detail. If not, we will move to page 2. Section 505.2 for exhaust ducts for domestic cooking exhaust equipment. Oh, no, is it showing? Or we do require in Oregon that a domestic cooking appliance be exhausted to the exterior. We don't allow natural ventilation. You either need to have, for domestic range, either a range hood exhausting to the exterior or a continuous ventilation under the residential ventilation tables. We will see more of that later when we get into residential ventilation. We're just making sure that continues. You will note on here, we also have from previous code sections, and there's some things in the model code that are happening. If you'll note item 5 about cooktops and ranges in I2 dormitory and in dormitories, need to comply with section 904.13 of the building code. I did want to point out that this, yes, is a fire and model code piece for when you have a cooktop in these certain conditions where they are subject to being left on and potentially have a fire. These require what is a UL 300A, I believe is the number for it. It's a slightly better grade residential range hood that has a small amount of fire retardant built into it, just in case there is a fire. And if it goes off, it automatically shuts off. It has an interlock to where it can cut power to the range. So this is for areas where you may have people who are subject to leaving a cooktop running. And this is just in alignment with what is in the building code and pointing out that that is required. So it's this is a standing Oregon amendment, which is really just pointing out what's happening in the building code and via the fire code. And our other standing item for residential ranges is about the equipment discharging to the exterior. We have the Oregon amendment not noted that we're changing the note to, referencing the building code and section 505.7 or 505.8 about the discharge. So we can scroll down to 507 and 8. This is an Oregon amendment again. Oh, IMC. This is a you will note that the next item is for section 505.7 and 505.8. These notes here are again pointing to what we've discussed previously. The model code brought in the language about in I1 and I2 occupancies, what has to be done for the mechanical ventilation at a range hood, making sure they discharge the outdoor. And by the sub-references in here, it is going back to the model code for safety. I did want to point out that and we should discuss this in detail since it's not allowed elsewhere, is in this section. There's an exception for listed and labeled ductless range hoods to be permitted where a charcoal filter is provided in the hood to reduce smoke and odors. When it comes to residential occupancies, the prior 2009 era construction claims task force pretty much designated that, range hood, if it's a residential range hood, it should exhaust to the outdoors. This is a question I want to put to the committee and for a little feedback on. Should there be an exception for I1 and I2 occupancies? They still have to have a special protection range hood that would have fire extinguishing and essentially a circuit breaker that cuts off power, or a relay that will cut off power or fuel to the range itself. That's still not being disallowed here, but this is allowing a recirculating system in these two occupancy types. And a question to the group, I think, that should come out is, do you wish to align more with residential occupancies that would have it go to the exterior, or have an additional exception for recirculating if there's a charcoal range hood or a charcoal filter?
Mark, can you clarify your comment on residential? Are you saying that in no case is recirculating allowed in residential? I thought that it was.
You can do recirculating if there is a continuous exhaust in the space.
Right.
So I would assume maybe the better clarification would be if continuous ventilation is provided in the space per.
Right. Yeah, this is like even your recirculating hood has to be slightly better if you're I1 or I2.
Mhm.
I was just curious if recirculate would conflict with that section requiring that more advanced level of fire protection, if you could even get a unit that has some fire suppression in it and recirculating.
They make them. They're big and bulky and expensive. This isn't actually requiring it doesn't look like in these recirculating hoods that they have the Ansel system in the recirculating hood.
Under the previous section and under the building code, when you get to 420.9, it does get to where it's a UL 300A, I believe is the number. It's a bulkier standard residential range hood on steroids that has a small extinguishing system and an interlock or a relay that can shut power to the range. So I'm not seeing how this is getting them out of that, to be honest. It would be that if that could have if they sell these, and I think some of them you can put a filter. I didn't know they had charcoal filters for them, but if it's possible. But I would believe that you would also want to have under other sections that if it's not exhausting to the exterior, that I believe under 403 you would still have to have, if you're not providing a intermittent operation, you would have to have space operation. You may not have to do a modification here. I think we can still point back to 403.
Hey, Mark, would this be something that we need to look at for a significant increase of costs?
This was covered in the 2022 for us, and it's already under the code. This might be an increase in cost. Maybe since it is saying 500 CFM, that would be the only change, is that they're actually specifying a minimum flow rate for these. So
I will make a note of that, Mark.
thank you, Pierre. Thank you, committee members. So no other comments at this time. We'll come back to this again at the next meeting. Next model code change is we're going to get into grease ducts. So And what they have come up with is a little, in the past, it had been light tests, and people had then, they've now come in to allow either a light test or a water spray test. And it also would still include an or approved equivalent pressure test. So past language has been rather limiting, that a grease duct really just had to have a light test, even though there are a lot of groups, and we've had past Oregon mechanical officials several years ago about these new water tests, and it is now being brought into model code to do a spray type system to do a grease duct leak test. So you have a choice between a light or a water spray test. And if you really read the language above in the first paragraph of section 506.3.2.5, or approved equivalent pressure test. So the model code is recognizing some of the more common systems that sometimes it takes them a long time to get caught up with new modern methods. So any questions on these? Any of the building officials seen people do a water test?
Yeah, Mark, I like it. I wonder, where we say approved equivalent pressure test, are we implying water test there or just air pressure test? Or do we just say we're approved equivalent test and leave it?
Equivalent. We aren't saying water or, yeah. You could do
Pressure makes it sound like air because the water's not literally under pressure in the duct, right? It's just sort of a watertight test. Anyway, I guess the word pressure in our approved equivalent line is my only question, but
anyone else on the committee think that maybe for equivalent test would be?
Yeah, I would agree with Tim on that pressure test, because then you might need some additional specifications there. What pressure, what equipment?
Okay, we'll put that in. How about we put that in as a Oregon amendment strike through for now to allow more flexibility in the field for people. So
yeah, and because it's not really allowing a water test, but then we go on to allow a water test, right? If we say like that whole line, and again, I don't want to belabor it, but this whole line is like a light test or approved equivalent test shall be performed. But then later we say, oh, you could do a light test or a water test. So maybe it should say light test, water test, or approved equivalent test. Anyway,
I
we
like
can move on.
From division standpoint, they really should have at model level said, they say it further down, the test shall be performed in accordance with either, but it probably should be in you shouldn't have
model
approval to do a water spray test without it gets fixed in the next paragraph, sort of, but that would make some clarity. I think we should do that. I see a hand in the room.
Richard Rogers here. Is there a test other than the light test and the water spray test?
I've seen some that have done sort of a duct blaster pressure test. It's not really, where some people have tried things like that, and who knows what's next. And all right. So before the or, it would be comma, water spray test or approved equivalent test. Thank you, committee. Oh, boy. All right. Okay, let's move on to commercial kitchen hood, section 507.1. There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 proposals that have come in to do some modifications to language for when a type 1 hood is required. When they, if we'll scroll up a little bit, let's start at the very beginning of 507.1. They added new language that a type 1 hood, new language says, shall be installed above, at or above appliances in accordance with 507.2. And then a type 2 shall be installed in accordance with 507.3. It had been, the original language for a while had been, either every appliance shall have either a type 1 or a type 2 above it. They've changed it up just a little bit to say type 1 appliance, type 1 hoods are for 507.2, type 2 or under 507.3. The exception language has been changed a little bit. A hood shall not be required above any of the following. So they have, again, it was about UL 710B recirculating systems. There are a few appliances where they've got their own grease capture systems. They're listed and rated for that. Downdraft appliances that have integrated hoods aren't required to have other hoods. That's an interesting correction on that. Smoker ovens, that was a great addition to the last code, that smoker ovens with integral exhaust systems and are listed for the application don't have to have a hood. That was probably 8 years of questions over those as barbecue restaurants gained popularity. They have added something that Oregon has had for a while: ovens listed and labeled for use with wood fuel in accordance with UL 2162 and vented in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. Has an Oregon amendment has made it to model code so that if you're cooking a pizza in an oven that is rated to work as a wood stove, you don't have to put a hood over those. An electric appliance listed and labeled in accordance with UL 197, and I want to add some emphasis on this, labeled in accordance with UL 197 for reduced grease emissions. Now, there are certain appliances that may not have that additional certification on those. To clarify that new change, I believe that some of the 197 appliances are things like some countertop combi ovens, and I believe even coffee makers, wine, and some minor heating plates wind up in this. So that's a good thing to say that, yes, it doesn't have to be under a hood. Commercial electric dishwashers incorporating a self-contained condensing system listed and labeled in accordance with UL 921. This is a good piece of language that we've had brought up in the past. Some of the new dishwashers do not release. They have special sterilizers and systems, and they are self-contained. They're not releasing a lot of moisture. They've developed a carve out for those. And the last one is, really, this used to be in the exception in section 507.3 for type 2 hoods. They have brought it here and it is where the heat and moisture loads from dishwashers and appliances that produce heat or moisture and do not produce grease or smoke as a result of the cooking process are incorporated into the HVAC system design or into the design of a separate removal system. We have made a modification to this to point out to meeting the requirements of section 50, the exception to section 507.3. And there's a reason for this, is because they brought all of that language in here about if you have an appliance in a kitchen that you're not putting under a type 2 hood, model code language has said for if you're not under a type 2 hood, you need to exhaust at a rate of 70 CFM, then assign 100 square feet per appliance that's not underneath there, and a minimum rate of 70 CFM. The language We did a lot to clean it up to make it very clear back in section 507.3, and we're just going to point people to that versus duplicating the language again here. So those are the new exceptions. So wood-fired ovens, they finally have that cleaned up. All right. Electric cooking appliances that just produce nothing. They're more, high-end residential grade under UL 197. Dishwashers that you'll find these a lot of bars, some of these type dishwashers where they don't produce a lot of moisture, and we get questions regularly about, oh, we've got this, it's a behind the bar dishwasher. Do we have to then put a type 2 hood over it? And this is one that's exempted altogether. Some of these new methods to cut down on the amount of heat and moisture that come out of them. And then last but not least, for items that are exempted from being under type 2 hood, it's just really a duplication of language in 507.3. Any questions or concerns on that part of the model, commercial hood language? They did a little extra down in 507.1.1. A lot of editorial clarification language came through with this, which is why it went through pretty easily. Is under 507.1.1, it says with either the listing of the hood or the sections about commercial kitchen hoods. A lot of the commercial kitchen hood language is, especially for type 1s, are really related to field constructed. And when you have a UL listed UL 726 hood, there's a lot of this chapter you don't have to comply with because they've been listed and labeled for the operation that they have. Any questions on commercial kitchen hoods? If not, you can look through. There's a bit of purple language that happens through this about a lot of editorial clarifications that happen there. But the next one is 507.1.2, domestic appliances used for commercial purposes. We are maintaining our additional exception about having either a type 1 or type 2 hood. We've for decades have had the exception that for a single domestic appliance where domestic cooking operations occur, such as a church, daycare center, fire station, and play lunchroom, those are exempted from needing a type 1 or a type 2 hood. And they're done with basically they can be done with a residential range hood. The point of this is, and in the past, it's allowed for a break room to have a domestic range in it, fire stations, a daycare center. When it's used for domestic cooking operations, such as not in a, and this is where there's been a regular look by the local building official for what are they intending to use it for. To get this exception, they do need to note that, number of meals they're cooking, items like that, to make sure that they don't turn around and turn it into a full commercial operation. So for that single appliance, it's been a very helpful exception in the past, also for things like schools in a classroom type setting. No questions? One item that was added that was right below that, which is really just a clarification about when you do have an atmospheric. They did add new section 507.1.3 about atmospheric appliances. If it's in a space where you have a type 1 or type 2 hood, you do need to make sure that it's either sealed combustion or it has some sort of, you take into account that you can, if you put in a natural draft water heater in a kitchen space, you need to make sure that it can still operate. It's more just a design note. and does provide options for the design community. But it's primarily editorial at that point. And that covers chapter 5, exhaust items. Let's move on to chapter 6, unless people, and again, take a look at this as you go through. I know we're giving you some chances to look through the changes that have happened. Under 6, section 601.5 on return air openings, we have some new items brought into model code. Return air, some of it's editorial, where it says return air for heating or air conditioning systems has been added. Whenever we say the return air, they keep adding heating or cooling systems, but new items are, exceptions are, or items required are return air from a closet shall serve only the closet and shall not require a dedicated closet supply duct. So that sounds like you can take some return from the closet, but only from the closet. Not interesting language, but the return air taking from a closet smaller than 30 square feet shall require the closet door to be undercut. So if you are taking any return air from a closet door, they decided they were going to put in some language to say you're going to need to undercut the door, or you shall have a louvered door or transfer grill. Model code probably was a lot of conversation over apartments and condominiums on that one, but it's just some additional language that people can available to make sure that if they're noting that you can take return air from a closet, and if you do, some minimum requirements that are necessary if it's a small closet to allow air to transfer into where you're taking return air from. Any questions on this new 2024 International Mechanical Code language? If not, in table 603.4, we are continuing to maintain the model code tables for minimum duct construction. If we'll scroll down a little bit to show what we strike out, get rather complicated as far as the water gauge, pressure of the fan systems and the like. We have the boards in the past have liked a fairly simpler table for round duct or rectangular duct for the minimum gauge for duct in residential. Let's scroll up a little bit, in a dwelling unit. So downstream of a small fan coil unit or a furnace or heat pump in a dwelling unit, we have a simplified table for the gauge of the ductwork in those units. And this is just maintaining current Oregon amendment, just to let people know and whether there's any desire to go back to model code or not maintain the current Oregon amendment. Going once, twice. With that, we will take it as people are okay with that one. A rather interesting but good change that came in was about duct coverings and linings. Something that had been in the code required that any duct covering or lining, regardless of its location, was being required to have a 25 flame spread, 50 smoke rating, even though everything else in the space, if you're outside of a plenum, everything else was allowed to have the 25 450. So this is allowing when you have a duct covering that's not in a plenum, it can have a higher smoke developed of 450. However, if there's a duct covering in a plenum, it will have to be like all other items in a plenum and having a 25 flame spread, 50 smoke rating. So it was really a clarification that there are some items that may be in the open spaces that cover ducts that won't be in a plenum, and then we'll be allowed to have a slight, the same essentially fire and flame and smoke spreads rating as any other item in that space. Any other questions, comments, concerns on chapter 6? Again, we can take a look through it. Under chapter 7, there were no changes under chapter 7. Chapter 8 of the IMC, there were no revisions and no Oregon revisions. Chapter 9, the one change of specific appliances that was made. Of course, we maintain some informative notes about solid fuel burning appliances and making sure people align with DEQ, but they added a new item for steam bath equipment. Didn't have a chance to clarify until just before the meeting, but they're noting that steam bath equipment, this is a new category of covered equipment in the mechanical code. It says it needs to be labeled in accordance with UL 499. We're going to be asking the committee to delete this section. This is covered. It's a plumbing appliance and covered by the plumbing code. And there's no sense in us mentioning it here because it is all under the plumbing code. So we're going to recommend and see whether the committee, we try not to have items that are covered under other codes duplicated elsewhere. And it's just about noting a listing. A steam bath equipment, it gets fed by potable water all the way to the discharge. And so that winds up completely within the plumbing code. They do require the same listing under the plumbing code, and it will be inspected and permitted under the plumbing code. Would the committee agree to deletion of this from the code, from the mechanical code, excuse me? I have confirmed that the UL 499 and all the other pieces are covered under the plumbing code.
Yeah, I would strike it out.
Okay. Anyone disagree with that or wish further consideration, or can we get a note for that for the staff to double red line? There are no changes. Oregon, there are no changes we're bringing forward in chapter 10 because for boilers and pressure water heaters and pressure vessels, we do have to take the entire chapter and essentially rework it to align with the boiler and pressure vessel program to cover the items that we do cover under the code. So things like exceptions and the like, we cover the piping and portions of a steam or hot water system that aren't potable under the plumbing code and aren't regulated under the boiler code. So we have sub references. We've really, the division has cleaned this up and turned it into the few pieces that would be covered under the mechanical code when not regulated by the boiler code are listed in here. But the language has to be adjusted a lot. There are items we have to strike out regarding anything, as you'll notice under section 1002.1, we don't list the required listings for water heaters because the plumbing code sets it, looks at it. It is one of those things that's completely statutorily out of our authority. We do not touch, we do not pass go, we do not collect $200 on this one. So on chapter 10, we have to administratively leave this sort of as is. And so we are going to go on and show chapter 11 and refrigeration. There was a lot that happened under refrigeration. 11, please. Do you have any hands or anything? Okay. All right. Okay. One note administratively before we get any further into this is that we've always had the first informative note about brazing certifications required, noting back to Oregon rules about certifications. One item that we are putting in here as a general note, when there are other regulations that might come into our world, we're adding a note that this is not for enforcement, but a reminder that persons engaged in service, repair, or disposal of equipment that could release refrigerants to the atmosphere shall be certified under the Environmental Protection Agency Section 608T or 608 Technician Certification Requirements under 40 CFR Part 82 Subpart F. This is a reminder that mechanical contractors know about the refrigerant requirements, but we're just doing an additional reminder out there for people that may be coming in from out of state or the like, that you do need to be careful about recovery and be aware of the recovery and requirements under the EPA for service and installation of refrigeration equipment. The first change, when we get into 11 that we're going to talk about, is section 1101.1 under 1101.1 part 2 for ammonia refrigerants. Let's look at that one first. The model codes have really said, let's get to looking at IIAR 2, and in other words, the national model standard for ammonia. It's very different from what happens with other refrigerant types. The new language for this year is a reference to IIAR 6, which is relative to some of the, it's primarily on post-construction, but there are some testing requirements in IIAR 6 that would be part of those constructing with ammonia systems. It's not a lot of them out there, but there are a few systems at bigger commercial plants, especially some of the food processing areas. The other item that is also on here, if you look in the line above, I'm flipping my page here on chapter 11. If you look in part 1101.1.1, they have added the refrigeration systems containing carbon dioxide as the refrigerant shall also comply with IIAR CO2. So there is a special refrigeration standard for carbon dioxide systems. Those are a little different than your typical refrigerant, and they do run at a little bit higher pressures. So that's noting an additional compliance standard that's available for refrigerants other than ammonia. So that was another change as well. Moving to my page 3, about changing refrigerants under section 1101.7. We'll come back to some of the other purple pieces here in a second. It's further down in hours. It was in model code, it's 1107. Here it's we'll have to get that added. It's about notification to owners for one of the new items coming in is that we're going to be seeing the changing. Oh, there it was. Oh, it was up. It was shown as all scratched out. Changing of refrigerants. Oh, yes, that. So in the past, this has been deleted about changing a refrigerant of letting owners. They have modified this language to just say owners shall be notified if a change in refrigerant occurs. That's the new language actually under owner or owner's agent. That was the change that happened. I forgot, yes, we do strike this section in its entirety because it is a post-occupancy item, but that was the change to the model level. I forgot. We do strike all this language. Just wanted to let you be aware that that had happened at model code level, that they wanted to make sure that you notify the owner's agent, which is sort of a outside of building code area anyway. Refrigeration standards. Okay, Sam, but there was one for the. I'm looking for the. There is a large scale refrigeration, so ammonia. Okay, under the SAM item, but also throughout. Every code cycle is the table. Are the tables further down? The tables for refrigerants get completely redone every code cycle to add new refrigerants to them and the amount of refrigerant occupied. Throughout Chapter 11, you will find that the committee, through a giant amendment, brought in the information from Standard 34, 2022. Yes. And so this is to bring in updates to the refrigerant tables, align the language to make sure that, you know, what modifications have been in Standard 90.1, or excuse me, Standard 34, 2022, and Standard 15 as well. These are the big ASHRAE standards that really are well thought out to control, and what we essentially redo here are coming up to the latest refrigerants, have the latest amounts that can safely be in a space. Those are brought in to update everything, but one item I wanted to note is that we'll have a question about statewide alternate methods. Every year when a new Standard 34 comes out, there will potentially be, how many pages are we now? Can you scroll down to there? Something like 6 pages of refrigerants. It was 3 pages when I started here at Building Codes Division. There will always be new refrigerants that will come out, and especially with the new requirements for low global warming potential refrigerants, that when new ones come out, the statewide alternate method 2104 will need to get updated to say, to allow the use of refrigerants listed under Standard 34, 2025. For a while, once this code is going through, the current SAM will be moot for about a 1-year period, but once that new refrigeration standard comes out, this will just allow the use of refrigerants that have gone through all of the safety processes. I just wanted to bring that up to everybody, that when we get to discussion of the SAM, that will be there. Well, I don't know whether anybody has gone through that or not yet, but hopefully the list of refrigerants that are on the table now won't expand much. You're going to see about 3 new refrigerants replacing 410A, 407, and I'm trying to remember one of the others, but the list stays on there because some of them, there are some places in buildings with those existing refrigerants in them, and you need to know whether they're safe or not. So, all right, sorry about that. Now, air conditioning for human comfort. Are we in 11? Next item on our list is 1104.3.1. What are we doing? Yeah, we're going to get to this. The change M75-21 is located on here, and this is about beginning to cover what is happening through federal regulations where the use of A2L refrigerants are going to be used a lot more And okay, this is a new section here about when it's used for human comfort. And it's saying that for human comfort, you should use A1 or A2L refrigerants when you're talking about for human comfort, with some exceptions for smaller quantities of other refrigerants. So they're getting this down to when it's outside of an industrial occupancy or in quantities over, if it's in a dwelling unit, you can have up to 6.6 pounds of a non-A1, a refrigerant outside the A1 or A2L safety categories. You can use them in a dwelling. If it's in a other commercial outside a residential occupancy, you can get up to 22 pounds of these other refrigerants, really trying to reduce when you're doing A1 and A2. Then when you get to A2, A3, or A3, B2, B3 refrigerants, A3 and B3 shall not be used except where approved, because these are really getting into higher both flammability and potential toxicity levels once we're in the B categories. So those limits are really you can still use them in laboratories because those are special items, self-contained units with very small quantities. Industrial occupancies, again, you may have something like this out at, say, an Intel fab plant, or when you, again, back to the same limitations, don't have a lot of these higher hazard category refrigerants in residential or commercial occupancies. They're coming up with more language on this due to the fact that really they're A1 refrigerants, there won't be many in use anymore. So because of some federal regulations on hazardous, the global warming potential of these refrigerants. That covers the 1104.3.1 and 1104.3.2 categories. And if there aren't any questions on this, we can go to the next Oregon. We have an Oregon amendment on machinery room means of egress, in that we want to make sure that it aligns with 1105.9. These are all previous changes. Oh, some of those previous notes are coming from standard 34. When it comes to means of egress from machinery rooms, we make sure that we point to the building code and the fire code items that have been brought into building code when it comes to means of egress. That's their bailiwick on, instead of trying to recreate building code language here, we point it to the correct location where the architect is looking at means of egress and items. And it also avoids in the past where there have been potential conflicts between codes on that. So that's the reason for the Oregon amendment here, of pointing to the people who have a better knowledge of means of egress. And the code that states what's required for, they do have it specifically to machinery rooms there. Under section 11, and again, anything you're seeing here in purple, if we can pause here for just a second. In 11.0, bringing in all of the standard 34 and standard 15 language, or these new A2L refrigerants, which have a low flammability. They're A2, they're flammable, but very low flame propagation refrigerants. It's really interesting to see demonstrations of it that you put a match to the sample and you can almost walk faster than the flame spreads. But when you get into these, there are new requirements aligning with standard 34. This is all brought in as one giant piece, that when you do have these refrigerants, it could have been disallowed in the past or required extra requirements to make things simpler and less costly. There are new allowances for these low probability flammable units to have refrigerant detectors. You're going to see a lot more of these in the future of when you exceed quantities under the refrigerant table. You can then have some alternate methods that are less expensive and easier to take care of versus having to have a lot of ventilation detectors and even potentially prohibiting the use of what will effectively be the only refrigerants available for a lot of the standard HVAC equipment out there. So thank you for the pause. Under 1108.1, that's our last item in chapter 11 we want to talk about now, although I will note one, after this, I'll bring up one other item. We are adding in so that it can be, we have a requirement that installers, under rule, that installers for refrigerant piping be have valid certification. It's either, the brazing cert or a welding certification. Is that by putting this here, it does give the building official the ability to ask to see that brazing card for people who are on site so that they know that it gives you a citable path to ask for it. It wasn't there. It could have been asked for, but this is just putting into code to make sure people have that ability to ask for it. Let's go back up to A2L of refrigerants, though. There is one change that's happening to the 20. We've had an outside organization ask us about this, and we are going to put this forward, is on the shafts. And that is in, we've already had questions from people outside. Sections further down. Here we go. We've already put this in, and we need to have this as a specific item on the final, is that the currently, if you were putting in any refrigerant other than an A1 and it went through two or more floor and ceiling assemblies, it was required to be in a 2-hour shaft. What was missed during the 2024 adoption process, even though they adopted standards 15 and 34 ASH latest versions for some reference points, they didn't catch one important change, is that when the current requirement is that pretty much any refrigerant other than A1, if it goes through 2 floors, has to be in a 2-hour shaft. There was an exception for refrigeration systems where the refrigerant quantity does not exceed the limits of table 1103.1. In other words, one that would require machinery, one where it could potentially be above hazardous levels. What is that only an A1 could be outside when it's in small quantities. What this change where you're striking using group A1 refrigerant is going to allow, and it's in standard 34 and 15, and it will be in the 2027 IMC, is that any refrigerant, if it's below those limits, which could require machinery room, refrigerant detectors and the like, we're going to have to be in a 2-hour shaft. What that means is that in about 2 years, when all of your mini split systems and split systems are using A2L refrigerant, if you're in a 3-story apartment building, they would have to be in a 2-hour shaft. Put in a mini split for an apartment. This, as long as the quantity is under the same limits for any other refrigerant for safe application without needing machinery rooms or refrigerant detectors, by striking this, any refrigerant that's below those hazardous quantities can now be installed. It's very important to have this in because all all residential systems, whether mini split or heat pumps, whatever, are going to be above that limit. So if you have a multi-story building that's running refrigerant through it, this is pretty important to have. Any questions on this one? We were going to bring this up as a separate item at the next meeting because it was sort of brought through it. For us, it was brought through sort of as a notification at the last minute. It was at the national code level brought forward by combination of home builders and the ASHRAE committee itself. ASHRAE was there supporting this, and it did pass for going into the 2027 code. So wanted to make people aware of this, that it's will be a big hurdle if this is not in here now for affordable housing. So that would be my last point on chapter 11. Can we go to hydronic piping? Under scope of hydronic piping, yes, they needed to say it, but hydronic piping, they have added some items to the scope of hydronic piping, which includes radiant heating, radiant cooling, and ground source heat pumps and snow and ice melting systems. What we had this, they finally recognized at model code that they had a lot of regulations for systems, but they never mentioned that they were covered in the scoping language. It's totally editorial, but we wanted to make sure people were aware of it. We have an Oregon amendment about PEX tubing in section 1209.1, and I believe they are catching up at the model level for this about embedded piping. But over time, we've needed to have this amendment in to allow other piping in embedded in concrete radiant systems. That is the section 1209.1. Under 1209.6, when it comes to tubing, this is one item where we want to note that there, they have added some language about limitations for circuit lengths and tubing sizes. So sort of a sizing guidance that probably was being done anyway for maximum length for different tube sizes when you're doing a radiant system, whether it's in a building, and 1209.7 has the same for snow melt, is to making sure that those are, they've essentially created sizing tables that obviously would align with the manufacturer's data, because this went through with no major objections at the national model code level. So, and they were there bringing this in, I believe was one of the manufacturers actually was the one who submitted this. So if we can scroll down a little bit more, I believe, did that? Oh, one item to note though, is that potentially we're saying, well, we'll ask whether or not you think there's potentially a cost involved with this one, because one thing it does have, if you look at the top of the page, 1209.6.2 and 6.3, is that each individual circuit or tubing shall have a label or tag securely affixed to each manifold outlet to indicate the length of each circuit served. There's a few dollars involved with that one to put tags on, and that the drawings that are done for them shall be provided to the building owner or designated representative. There's additional requirements there so that people know where hopefully the pipe will be when they're done, which could provide, this could be a potential cost item. And ask you now, do you think this would add a little extra beyond current code? With no response, we'll say minor on extra costs. Pierre?
Okay.
Chapters 13 and 14, when it comes to fuel oil piping and solar systems, there have been no changes on those. When it comes to appendices in the state of Oregon, Any appendix is not adopted as a citable code. There are, if it is something that we do adopt, we go through the committee and say, yes, this is, an adopted appendix, and we add that to chapter 1. Otherwise, we don't. There are 2 new appendices, one for clean air delivery and one for clean air delivery and monitoring, which would set some additional requirements for putting carbon dioxide sensors in a lot of occupancies. Again, we would not be adopting those. And so now that we're done with the early appendices, we're going to go to big Appendix C, Fuel Gas. And that is where we bring the International Fuel Gas Code in with Oregon amendments. So a lot of our work in this chapter is, of course, existing Oregon amendments you see a lot of blue here because we're renumbering everything. We are taking what is the International Fuel Gas Code and making it an appendix for Oregon. Some of the items, like some existing Oregon amendments that we might want to point it out to look at, is section 307.2. By the way, this year at the national model code level, there were 7 proposed changes, and I think 3 of them were accepted. And we're going to go over 2 of them today, because the others are primarily editorial, are really just editorial. Under condensate piping, this was brought in to make sure that there was a model code requirement that when you have a secondary drain, that it be marked to indicate where the piping is connected, that it be marked. And what our code committee added was that secondary drain be, so if your primary drain is clogged, you've got a secondary one that terminates somewhere, you need something to say, oh, that's coming out of the secondary drain. That means there's a problem. Please go look and see, just like a roof overflow drain. See something popping out of that, you got issues. They did a modification to say that should be an embossed or engraved tag or in an otherwise approved manner to make sure that people knew it wasn't just a Sharpie saying, hey, this is secondary drain on the secondary drain discharge. That is one area where, again, we really appreciate these committees and our boards to go, that's when the secondary drain marking came in, the committee said, we might want a little bit more. So just an example for you, so that's just carrying forward. Let's go down to C310A on CSST piping. On bonding of the piping, we don't put the language in here about how to bond piping. That is the electrical code, and that's where you kind of get into different worlds. We make sure that we say that the CSST piping shall be bonded in accordance with the electrical code. There's some basics there, but also in accordance with the manufacturer's installation instructions. And some manufacturers require, depending on the type of CSST piping, additional bonding above and beyond, but it does need to be in accordance. The person who does the bonding of the piping will have to be an electrician doing said bonding. So if you're doing the yellow gas, flexible gas piping, it needs to be, there are some additional jumpers and size of bonding that needs to be done. And in accordance with the electrical code, also make sure that I have seen some prior installation instructions that potentially created a separate path to ground that the electricians did not like. So that makes sure that whoever's doing the bonding isn't driving extra ground rods and creating separate paths to ground. Then protection against physical damage. one thing we did for section C 404.7, again, model code, we require strike plate protection at, say, where you're running a gas pipe through a stud to make sure somebody doesn't drive a nail in and hit CSST pipe where it's going through a wall, just like we protect electrical and plumbing piping, the requirement for strike plates. One thing we noted, though, is that there is the ability, the exception in model code was for black steel piping, but it didn't clarify. There are some pipes types that can be done with new special press fit that can be Schedule 10. It can be thinner pipe, and so to make sure that we're looking at protecting pipe that, you know, you hit a Schedule 40 pipe with a nail, it's not going to do much to it, but we want to make sure that if it's thin wall pipe, it's protected. And last but not least on our list for today is the one model code change of significance for fuel gas. And that was that they did add in that for commercial incinerators and crematories. Where's that one now? C60. There's a listing that didn't make it in. They have added in the listing for commercial crematories. There's now an actual, they are, oh, scroll down a little more. Nope, it is under 6. Okay. They have that, there is a listing that will be in the reference standard. So really, you can now have a listed item at a crematorium. So have that one as a note, okay? All right. And so that is the set of major items we are doing today. Again, when we come back on the next meeting, we'll go through, decide whether we want to go chapter by chapter. And let's go back to chapter 4 though, real quick. And we'll go to the 403 point 3.2.3. One big item that, yeah, you just scroll past, okay. On outdoor air flow rates, or where are we? Oh, it didn't make it in. 403.3. There's a model code change where they are striking under 403.3. Group R2, 3, and 4 occupancies 3 stories or less in height is being struck. It is for all R2, 3, and 4, regardless of height, will be in there. So the 3 stories or less in height above grade plane is out. So any building with these occupancies falls under, there's a residential section later. And so no more, because there's a big difference between the tables, which base their numbers on air change rates. So if you had an apartment with, or let's say a condo, penthouse apartment with 10-foot ceilings, they had to move a whole lot more air than other apartments. And so by doing this, we'll now go down to 403.2 and some changes here. So now all apartments will go down, well, 2 point, let's scroll down more, 432.3. That's the other, once we get past all the tables. Want everyone thinking about this one when we go down to, okay, yeah. They forgot to strike this for 403.3.2, excuse me, or only 3 stories and less were getting put here in the past. Now all dwelling units And it is, if we could get past the, all dwelling units are coming here. One thing that happened during the modifications at committee, they changed the table outdoor air flow rate as well. If you look at equation 4-9, the flow rate was, went too fast. Yeah. The flow rate was 0.01 CFM per square foot of conditioned floor area, plus 7.5 times the number of bedrooms plus 1. During the committee hearing, it changed to 0.03. This represents on average, about a 60% increase in the airflow rate, which we want to talk about at the next committee is the final quantity that goes in. Under Oregon, we do have some very different, and let's scroll down to our bathroom exhaust as well, is we do have some very different things in our exhaust flow rates. Something that we have above model code, again, are the requirement for controlled fans so that if, you can run it and control humidity and mold in bathrooms and kitchens, well above model code. That has been very successful for us. Looking at this holistically at the next meeting, it was a rather big change going with the 62 quantity of 0.03. From an energy standpoint, it can be a pretty substantive amount. The division is asking that the committee look closely at going from something that has worked well for some time for us to do such a substantive change in the quantity of air and look at it holistically as we're bringing in all our occupancies into, other than hotels, into this, and also potentially consider what might happen with different system types, whether it's a very simple low income that has PTACs in the walls, how this operates, whether to bring in things that we have in the residential side, and they're looking at this from the model code next cycle, whether the dwelling occupant has the ability to cut off their outdoor air, either when they're out of their home or, as we've seen locally, and there's been some concern and some directive to us at the division, what happens during outdoor air quality events where there's smoke events that, you can have air that you can literally chew, to have that under special consideration. So with that, want people thinking about this for the next meeting. We may send some additional materials to you, and probably a link to the original, to the code hearing information. Any questions on this one? But this is one we wanted to save for probably a bigger discussion at the next meeting. So this will probably be its own line item. Other than that, any questions from the committee? I think we can give everybody some time back today, since we're through everything and the items we wanted to get through, and let you know about the bigger items for next meeting. Yeah. So is everyone familiar with the committee page the link that's been sent to everyone from the committee members?
Yes, we got it.
That's one person. I want to hear more yeses.
Yes.
Yes, I got it.
Got it.
Okay. My one, hey guys, how you doing? So with that, if there are any questions, please, take a look a little bit more. I'm sorry how fast this goes through, but one big point of this is that this year was probably the most simple alignment, one with the least amount of controversy of any IMCs brought in for some time. I may ask, can I ask one other thing for them to look at as well? Under refrigeration, under Chapter 11, if you don't mind bringing this up, just one last item for everybody to look at. That is the refrigerant safety caps item. It's 611. It's 1. Locking access port caps. There we go. 11. On roofs or areas locked access. In the residential, we've had this general of refrigerant caps on tamper resistant caps required, or the Schrader valves for filling shall be otherwise secured to prevent unauthorized access. And whether or not you would like to get some clarity, it would be nice to have some clarity on that. In the past, we have through discussions, it's been, if it's a two-step process to get to it, if you have to take off the cover off of, say, a chiller or a condensing unit, and then had to get a tool to take the cap off, that was sort of a otherwise secured. And it also currently has, in controlled areas such as roofs with locked access hatches or doors, is a current exception. Just, are we still looking at refrigeration? Is this actually being done and enforced on big commercial equipment or not? And whether or not with the changes in refrigerants that's happening with pretty much all equipment, what the application of this, or whether any extra clarity is required for this section. So just food for thought, because it hasn't come up in several years, but with the change in refrigerants, whether or not that needs any additional look from the Oregon perspective, that would be great. So with that, I will say, are there any other, first ask for any other comments, or if not, I will let everybody have a out to lunch a little early. On the 12th of September, oh yes, do mention the next meeting is on the 12th of September, beginning at 9:30 a.m. I don't think we'll need to stay till 3, hopefully, but I do expect everybody to, do a little bit of homework, come back and provide some feedback, and then we will work through and probably look at by chapter with a few special noted items other than by chapter, potentially have some votes that way. Yeah. Oh, yes. And if there are particular things you want brought to attention and put on the list, again, this is rather informal, please feel free to email Laura Burns with the division, and we can have them ready to go. We can actually put out, if you see something and go, this language would be better stated this way, we would be more than happy to look at it. And with that, we really appreciate your participation. Thanks a lot, folks. Thank you for great feedback today. We will see you on the 12th. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Everyone.